Today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, my philosophical and religious journey. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Welcome to the Nathan Jacobs podcast, everybody. If things sound a little bit different today, that's because I'm actually traveling. Now, today on the podcast, what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you, my listeners, a little bit about my philosophical and religious journey. This has actually come up in a variety of places, a variety of episodes, a variety of interviews, where I've talked about some of the things that sparked my interest in philosophy and religion and sent me down the road of studying the history of ideas. Obviously, I've mentioned that I am Eastern Orthodox, so spoiler, where that journey ultimately leads me. But rather than dealing with it in this sort of piecemeal fashion, I thought it might be worth sharing a more, thorough, fleshed out picture of what that journey really looks like. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually read something that I've written on that journey. There's a book that was published a few years back by St. Vladimir's Press called Turning East. And that book was assembled by Rico Witz, professor of philosophy, who is also Orthodox. And he had noticed that there was this trend amongst different philosophers that he knew in the academy who had gone through different journeys and actually become Eastern Orthodox. And so he thought this was an intriguing trend worth looking at. And what he pitched to St. Vlad's was the idea of reaching out to these different philosophers and having them write up their journeys. What is it that brought them into Eastern Orthodoxy? And so he assembled this volume, Turning East. Well, I guess the volume was successful enough that St. Vlad's wanted to do a second volume, a new collection of essays with new philosophers. Now, Rico didn't know me at the time, and I wasn't even Orthodox yet. So I became Orthodox, let's see, is it 8 years now? So that would be I want to say it was 2016 that I became Orthodox, and the book came out in 2012. So I wouldn't be Orthodox for another 4 years. But Rico reached out to me when he was putting out a new volume, which is not yet out, and asked if I'd be willing to contribute to it. So I ended up writing up my journey to Orthodoxy. So in the interest of sharing with you, dear listeners, my story of how I got into philosophy and religion and ultimately became Orthodox, I thought perhaps the best way to do that is just to share with you the chapter that I wrote for this upcoming book, Turning East. So with that, let's jump on in. Section 1, Early Life. When recounting my journey to Orthodoxy, I cannot deny the role that my mother played. I say this ironically, since she is not Orthodox. She comes from a long line of German Lutherans and was raised in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, one of the more conservative branches of the denomination. And so I, too, was raised Lutheran. My mother was devout. My father was not. As a child, I was unsure that my father believed anything of the Christian faith, despite supporting how my mother chose to raise us. Nonetheless, my mother's personal devotion and her concern for the salvation of her children and others impressed upon me the importance of religious matters that evidently had eternal consequences. Argument was a family staple. Some of my fondest childhood memories are of our smoke-filled kitchen. My father was a smoker, and back then people smoked in their homes, reverberating with a cacophony of raised voices and the percussive sounds of pounding on the kitchen table to punctuate a point as my family members argued boisterously. Though to argue was native to my family, without my mother's influence, such arguments would likely have been relegated to politics. But she added philosophy and religion to the mix. The reason is that my mother went through a time of struggle in her faith, questioning the truth of Christianity. The crisis sent her down a road of reading Christian apologists of various sorts, some on science, others on philosophy, others on religious plurality. She was therefore well-versed in apologetics, much more so than the average layperson, and she liberally shared those resources with her children. The result, which delighted me as a child, was verbose talks in our family about proofs for and against Christianity, in which the faithful and the skeptics alike sounded off. Such talks, or better debates, awakened my childhood mind and instilled in me a sense of the reasonableness of Christianity. I was still quite young, only in grade school, when I went from an observer of apologetics to a reader. Two early memories stand out, though I cannot recall which came first. I was reading the book of Genesis for no particular reason. I've never been a casual reader, so even as a child I moved slowly through the text, meticulously trying to understand what was being said. My careful reading led me to believe that Moses thought of the earth as a flat surface upheld by pillars with a dome over top, which held back water that occasionally breaks through in the form of rain. As an adult, I would learn that this is precisely what many ancient Near Eastern scholars also believe Moses is describing. When pointing out to my mother the apparent errors in the reportedly infallible text, she handed me a book by Hugh Ross, an astrophysicist turned Christian apologist who has devoted a great deal of time to defending the scientific accuracy of Genesis. Though I would not endorse Ross's work today, this early experience taught me that questions are nothing to be afraid of. Quite the contrary, questions are the doorway to fascinating discoveries. A second formative experience was initiated not by myself, but by my mother. She was aware that my private Lutheran grade school had on its docket creation science. In preparation for these lessons, she made me aware that they would teach that the earth was created in only 6 24-hour days some thousands of years ago. She told me this is false, based on a superficial misreading of the Bible. I should not take the lesson seriously. She then pointed me to resources should I want to know more. This experience instilled in me a second lesson that would be formative in my journey, namely, that commonly held church teachings can be questioned without abandoning one's faith. I should add an ironic third lesson from my childhood. This I learned not from my mother, but from the Lutheran Church. The denomination took seriously catechesis. I was made to memorize creeds, the Ten Commandments, and doctrinal formulations about the Trinity and Christology, all in preparation for confirmation in the Lutheran Church. For whatever reason, some of these catechal lessons stuck in ways that proved formative later in life. Let the irony suffice that while learning from my mother that all commonly held Christian commitments are up for grabs, I was learning from the Lutheran Church Christian commitments that are non-negotiable. For all the good that came from my Christian upbringing, there was a glaring deficiency in it. The view of salvation instilled in me from infancy. The conservative Lutherans who raised me still lived in the Reformation. The great debate is whether salvation is by works or by faith, and the greatest enemy to one's soul is the thought that one might earn God's favor. Hence my mother instilled in me that if I were to die and stand before God and be asked why I should enter heaven, I should answer, because Jesus died for my sins. But I was left with a simple question: how should I live? Because all sins are forgiven, and a life of good works has no bearing on one's standing with God, perhaps even being spiritually perilous, I was left with the impression that how I lived did not matter. My sins did not matter. So I abandoned all Christian practice in my teens, not out of contempt for the Christian religion. I had been persuaded it was likely true, but because my life choices seemed to be of no consequence. Thus, I embraced hedonism, for I was a lover of pleasure. Section 2. The Spiritual Awakening. My hedonism centered around what was, at the time, my one true love, art, specifically classical drawing and painting. From my earliest memories, I was known as an artist. Peers and adults alike presumed I would grow up to be a successful one. In my teenage years, I lived out this identity. Art was my central pursuit, one I aggressively went after with an eye fixed on art school and a profession beyond. During this time, I discovered hallucinogens. I deeply enjoyed the ways in which drugs allowed me to see my artwork with fresh eyes, fueled creative exploration, and broke down creative inhibitions. So drugs became a staple of my life, imbibed daily alongside my creative endeavors. I share this because LSD, or acid, played an important role in my spiritual awakening. Be warned, dear reader, if you hope to hear something about the trendy notion that LSD has spiritual benefits, opening the mind to the divinity around us, then what I am about to say will disappoint. The experience I'm about to recount awakened me not to the fact that God is everywhere present and fills all things, but instead to the reality of hell. For readers unfamiliar with LSD, it is important to understand that LSD takes one on a psychic trip, to use the colloquial term. Such a trip lasts a very long time, in my experience, upwards of 8 hours, and there is no sobering up. Once you imbibe the drug, you are buckled into the roller coaster. There's no getting off until the ride runs its course. For this reason, bad trips can be terrifying. If something goes amiss, there is no jumping ship. And such was the fateful event in my life. I was in the midst of an acid trip that went wrong, and I wanted off the ride. I began to think through possible solutions. The first, most obvious solution was suicide. Now, I need to again explain for those inexperienced with LSD that this thought was not induced by despair. On acid, many of the things we take for granted are no longer obvious. Gravity, for example, may seem a perfectly obvious and intelligible fact of reality to the sober mind. Yet, on acid, gravity may suddenly strike one as arbitrary, strange, even absurd. One's thought horizon expands considerably on the drug, which is precisely what I enjoyed about it. Keeping this in mind, then, my thought that I could kill myself and end the trip was not a suicidal thought, in the sense of one born from despair. The thought was perfectly analytic. Considering that I was in a negative psychic state induced by chemicals, were I to kill the organ facilitating the psychic state, that would, presumably, end the psychic experience. However, the moment I thought this, a second thought entered my mind. Consciousness is not a material object. Why then presume that the death of the material object to which it is attached will end my consciousness? In this moment, I intuited Socrates' affinity argument for the immortality of the soul, though I would not read the argument until years later. My inner dialogue brought to light the fact that consciousness generally, and my consciousness specifically, is not material. It evidently interacts with matter, apparent from the fact that altering my brain chemistry with LSD had altered my experiences. But it suddenly became less obvious to me that killing my brain would result in the end of my mind, since these were evidently two distinct things. On the heels of this first realization came a second, or rather, a question. What if killing my brain fails to end my psychic terror? I was acutely aware that my goal was to stop a terrifying psychic state, and I was equally aware that the chemicals I had ingested were what induced that psychic state. But equally clear in this moment was that the psychic state was exactly that, a state of mind. And if it were possible that my mind might survive the death of the body, then equally possible was that my psychic terror would endure. And here, for the first time, the concept of hell became plausible to me, not as a location filled with flames and devils, but as a state or condition of the soul. Terror gripped me. I became acutely aware that with each passing second, death moved one step closer to me. There was no stopping it. Suddenly, all of the warnings from religions made sense. We shape our soul in this world, and that shape endures in the next. As I was experiencing in real time, one can shape the soul into something dreadful, into a twisted state of terror from which there is no escape, not because one finds himself in a locked room, but because the terror is in the soul itself. In this moment, I saw religious questions about God, the afterlife, salvation, and damnation as the most important questions. Every second seemed precious, part of the limited time given to set one's house in order before the unrelenting strides of death arrive. So I wasted no time. Inadvisable as it was, I climbed into my car, still tripping on acid, and drove home. I found a Bible and began to read. Rather, I tried to read. Reading on LSD is not an easy task. After hours of staring at the first page to which it opened, I still had not moved beyond the first sentence I saw. Quote, "It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire." End quote. Upon returning to myself, I began to obsessively pursue answers. I spoke with relatives, pastors, apologists, peers, anyone who was willing to talk about matters of religion in a serious manner. To my surprise and disappointment, I found 2 troubling patterns. The first was that very few people took these questions as seriously as I did, including people who ought to. I recall a perplexed pastor asking during my interrogation of him if I was on something. I was not. He couldn't understand my obsession. I was equally perplexed. Having been awakened to the importance of such matters, I could no longer see them any other way. I thought a pastor of all people would understand. The second pattern I noticed was how few people were willing to consider unpleasant possibilities. So many of the folks I spoke with wanted to assure me that God loves me, put me at ease that I'm not going to hell. But this always struck me as an unjustified saccharine sentiment. Our world is filled with terrible truths. Why presume the answers to these or any other questions are pleasant? I was looking for truth, not comfort. And so, I resolved to entertain the most troubling possibilities, never shunning a view because I found it undesirable. For the next several years, I continued to speak with anyone who might offer insights. I tracked down scholars and professors at schools I didn't attend. I discovered the vast body of literature on philosophy and religion. I began to obsessively read, comparing the arguments from this work to that, tracing footnotes to more sources. All of this stretched over years, from high school into my third year of art school. The obsession became a hindrance to my art, as I was neglecting such work in order to devote myself fully to this investigation. I finally resolved to leave art school and continue my pursuit unimpeded by formally studying philosophy and religion. Section 3. A disappointing investigation. From my undergraduate years through my master's and into my doctorate, my study of philosophy and religion cast a wide net across ancient, medieval, and modern thought. I wanted a sense of the history of ideas on the topics I cared about. I had no preconceived notion of where truth may be found. I had no bias toward the contemporary over the ancient, or the religious over the irreligious. I did not presume that the trajectory of history marked progress rather than regress. I only hoped that by gaining a sense of the whole, I might spot those areas that are most promising, most pregnant with truth, that I might delve deeper into those waters. Such was my approach, and a great deal of fruit came from those years. Space does not permit me to examine it all. Instead, I will focus on one particular investigation that proved disappointing, informatively so. My early investigation of religion focused heavily, and not surprisingly, on Christianity. As explained above, I had already been persuaded of its reasonableness and likely truth. But there was a Pascalian element to this emphasis as well. Put concisely, my early look at other religions left me with the sense that the exclusivity of Christianity, that Christ is the only way to God, was an oddity in the religious realm. Hence, the stakes of misjudging Christianity to be false seemed higher than with other religions. Weighting my investigation more heavily toward the Christian religion, therefore, seemed prudent. My approach was again historical. I wanted to understand the history of Christian thought and practice. Toward this end, I began by devoting myself to the works of Augustine of Hippo. I recognized that both Roman Catholic and magisterial Protestant traditions lay claim to Augustine as the father of their doctrine. So, I went to the fountainhead of Western Christian thought. Augustine became to me a doorway to other thinkers, spidering out into a history of ideas all its own. Learning of the influence of certain books of the Platonists, either Plotinus or Porphyry, on Augustine's thought propelled me into a study of the Neoplatonists who influenced him. And the study of these Neoplatonists required me to study their namesake, Plato. Moreover, my study of Augustine sent me not only backwards to his influences, but forward to his influence, where I investigated the medieval reception of his thought in figures such as Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, John Duns Scotus, and others, and beyond these into the Reformers and the post-Reformation scholastics. And these figures in turn required me to study Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. I confess that my investigation commenced with great hope. As an artist, I loved the art and architecture of the Catholic Church. As a budding philosopher, the robust intellectual tradition of the Latin scholastics appealed to me. I would have loved nothing more than to discover in Augustine a fountain of truth that would lead me to not only answers, but tradition, religious practices, and grand religious artwork. Unfortunately, the result was quite the opposite. The more I studied Augustine and his progeny, the more Western Christianity repelled me. In modern German literature, I encountered a narrative that suggests that the history of Christian doctrine is syncretistic, a narrative I was increasingly sympathetic to based on my study of the primary sources. So the story goes, original Christianity was a Jewish religion, But with the conversion of Gentile philosophers, there arose a hybridization with Hellenism. In Adolf von Harnack, this narrative pervades his church history. In German idealists such as G.W.F. Hegel, such syncretism is praised as part of the progress that they continue. Yet I found the very same narrative in contemporary Anglophone writers who were critical of Hellenic theology, arguing that the God of the philosophers supplanted the God of the Jews. Process philosophers and open theists, for example, use this narrative as proof of something amiss in Christian thought, something deeply in need of correction in order to recover theological truths that have been lost. My sympathies for the narrative were both theological and philosophical in nature. Theologically, not only did I see the ubiquity of Hellenistic philosophy amongst Latin writers, but I sensed the theological divergence this syncretism represented. Put bluntly, I did not recognize the God of the Scriptures in the works of Latin theology. In Scripture, I read about a God who is free, relational, active, immanent, dynamic, even penitent. By contrast, in Latin theology, I saw how doctrines of simplicity, omniscience, immutability, and other classical attributes problematized the God of the Jews. The more I studied, the more I saw the scholastic tradition as an elaborate effort to cling to the God of the philosophers, while somehow saying of God that which Christians know they must. But for all the scholastic ink poured out to resolve the polarity, I saw only a failed effort to reconcile the irreconcilable. Philosophically, I was greatly sympathetic to the critiques of Western Christianity. To name just a few, I saw original sin and inherited guilt as unjust. Yet, even if these were somehow unpleasant facts of reality, I failed to see how they offered to God the judicial latitude to arbitrarily damn the infected, be they infants, or the predestined reprobate. In such doctrines, I saw an unjust God at best, and something approaching devil worship at worst. And I saw this same twisted sense of justice in the doctrines of hell and penal substitution. I was quite familiar with the standard responses to such critiques, but I found them impotent to alleviate the problems. All of this was troubling for a particular reason. By this point, I had become increasingly convinced of the existence of God, and I was also convinced that reason offered the clearest window into the nature of God, whether because the mind is a divine spark or a small replica of divinity. I thus saw my moral intuitions as offering unique insight into the nature of God, into his goodness and justice, for example. Yet it seemed that classical Western Christianity perpetually ran up against my conscience, insisting that I set aside my moral objections to original sin or predestination or other doctrines. For who are you, O man, to talk back to God? But a thought troubled me. If the Christian religion is true, then why does it perpetually run afoul of the most godlike thing about me? Why are its teachings at perpetual odds with the one faculty I possess that offers a window into the divine? In the end, I sided with the aforementioned narrative. Western Christianity, which was the only historical Christianity I knew, is a form of syncretism that obscured whatever truth was there at the origins of the Christian religion. So I chose to follow those who had concluded the same, while not fully abandoning belief in Jesus of Nazareth. In a word, I embraced process philosophy. Section 4. A philosophy of process. For those unfamiliar with process philosophy, the view is a form of panentheism, neither conflating God and world, pantheism, nor fully separating them, theism. Instead, God and world are both open systems, each in development and in reciprocal relationship, affecting and being affected by one another. Not surprisingly, then, the view rejects the classical divine attributes, accepting that God does, in fact, change, that his knowledge grows with the world, that his control of cosmic events and free creatures is limited, and so on. Two things drew me to process thought. The first was the dissonance between the God of the Scriptures and the God of Latin theology, explained above. The process God seemed to me much closer to the God I read about in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and I discovered I was far from alone in this conclusion. A great many Old Testament scholars also had process sympathies. Many saw a very different God in these ancient Near Eastern texts than the God of Plato or Aristotle, and a number of these scholars, such as Terence Fretheim and Robert Noose, explicitly embrace process philosophy as a more accurate model for Old Testament theology. Such trends vindicated my findings and endeared me to process thought. The second was the problem of evil. The classical formulation is David Hume's summary of Epicurus. Quote, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?" End quote. The problem attempts to demonstrate an incompatibility between the existence of evil on the one hand and the divine attributes of omnipotence and omnibenevolence, and tacitly the other omnis, on the other. While ample literature exists on the compatibility of evil and classical theism, process philosophy has an easier time resolving the tension because it rejects the classical divine attributes. Throughout my philosophical religious journey, I took the problem of evil extremely seriously. Evident to me was the problem's status as the chief anti-proof for the existence of God. Less evident to me, however, was the success of this anti-proof. I do not mean that the horrific events of our world are without force in causing one to question whether God is watching or cares. They have such force. But it was clear to me that good and evil in the moral sense that the problem presumes cannot exist in the world of the atheist. A material world of chance and chaos cannot include justice, fairness, good, or evil. It may produce sentient beings who experience pleasure and pain. Such beings may label the desirable good and the undesirable bad. They may feel entitled to the desirable and to freedom from the undesirable, calling such entitlement fair or just. But all of this can indicate nothing more than preferred experiences. The notion that things ought to be a certain way and ought not be another way has no place in such a world. Yet the central premise of the problem of evil is that evil exists. The indictment of God by the problem presumes duties of goodness incumbent upon a good God. In short, the problem requires transcendent values, the very sort of values it undermines if it succeeds in proving atheism. Hence, I saw the atheistic use of the problem as incoherent. But this is not its sole use. The problem can just as well be used to problematize classical theism, showing that the reality of evil requires a God who is not of the kind posited by the omnis. This conclusion was what sent me into the arms of process philosophy. Following my embrace of process thought, my research program forked into two parallel tasks. The first was defending metaphysics against its supposed demise. I learned that many contemporary philosophers believe metaphysics is dead, being some relic of the past only practiced by those who have yet to receive the memo. Because my own journey propelled me immediately into metaphysics, I had trouble seeing how this was possible. My finding was that this contemporary snobbery was not based on any demonstration that metaphysics is impossible or unnecessary, but upon a postmodern acceptance of the subjectivity of reason and its inability to discern objective truth. The result reduces philosophy to sociology, psychology, and anthropology, paired with a deference to contemporary physics on the nature of reality. To this postmodern disposition, I was unsympathetic. I could see how such cynicism follows from the failures of modernity, but I did not see how this failed experiment proved the impotence of reason to yield truth. As I said, I had no preconceived bias favoring the new to the old. I could grant that the modern project failed, but I saw this as little more than a set of warning signs about dead ends. I was not sympathetic to skepticism. As a first principle, I was committed to the idea that properly functioning faculties are aimed at truth-telling, and I saw something incoherent in the postmodern disposition to speak decisively about the limits and subjectivity of reason as if they were describing objective truths about reality, all while simultaneously denying the capacity of reason to discern objective truths about reality. I found that many trace the death of metaphysics to Immanuel Kant. Thus, I devoted years to studying Kant's work, seeking to understand his thought and his case against metaphysics. I would become known as a Kant scholar because of the influence of this research. However, unlike most Kant scholars who delve into his writings because they find him insightful, my disposition was quite the opposite. Few figures in the history of ideas do I think are more wrong than Kant. As for his attack on metaphysics, I was underwhelmed. If Kant is the murderer of metaphysics, then the report that metaphysics is dead is grossly exaggerated. Suffice it to say, for our purposes here, I determined that Kant's rejection of metaphysics begins with a supposition, namely, his own system. If one rejects his system, specifically his turn to the subject, then nothing Kant says follows. And I did reject Kant's system. I saw it as little more than a symptom of the burgeoning failures of the modern project. Nonetheless, so as to fortify my commitment to metaphysics against critics, I devoted inordinate amounts of time to his work. The second prong of my research program was constructive. Here, my heretical impulses flourished. I delighted in questioning the assumptions of classical theism, challenging the various omnis traditionally predicated of God. I proudly opposed the God-world divide of theism, embracing panentheism, and even toyed with pantheism. I happily questioned the infallibility of Holy Scripture, arguing that the evolution of the sacred texts is as developmental as both God and world. Although I retained a commitment to the Trinity and the dual nature of Christology, these being remnants of the catechesis I received as a youth, my commitments bore only a thin resemblance to the most superficial reading of the formulas of Nicaea and Chalcedon. I eyed body-soul dualism with suspicion, being prone toward physicalism. As a result, I questioned the immortality of the soul, presumed in the traditional doctrine of hell, and gravitated toward annihilationism. The list goes on. Beneath all of these innovations sat a disdain for Platonism as the poison to be siphoned from the anemic body of historical Christian doctrine. My remedy to Platonic realism was my commitment to nominalism, and my remedy to its dualism was my commitment to materialism, commitments borne out in the types of innovations cataloged above. A critical shift occurred in my thinking when finishing my master's thesis, however. My work had evolved into a direct assault on the metaphysics of the Augustinian tradition in order to make way for an alternative metaphysic of nominalism and materialism, essentially a resuscitation of the mechanical philosophy with a trajectory toward process thought. But during the construction of my alternative, I hit a roadblock. I realized that my burgeoning system of thought required the concept of corruption, of a distinction between the normal and the abnormal, the properly formed and the malformed, not as descriptions of general commonalities, but as normative prescriptions. Yet, within my nominalist materialist framework, grounding prescriptive norms proved difficult. The only solution I could offer was that God has an ideal concept of the thing in question, and the material formulation is divergent from that ideal. In this moment, I became a Platonist, accepting the concept of divine archetypal ideas. Realism suddenly seemed inevitable, and nominalism indefensible. The specific form of realism to which I would ascribe was not yet clear to me, but I knew I could no longer embrace nominalism or its fruits. The shift upset my entire project and sent me back to the history of ideas with fresh eyes. Now ancient philosophy seemed to me like a steady trek toward truth. I saw in these ancient writers a shift from the early materialist philosophers of the pre-Socratics towards something approaching realism, a trajectory that culminates in Plato and Flowers and Aristotle. The embrace of realism by the Alexandrian Jews, especially Philo, and early Christians now seem more reasonable, more defensible, even biblical, as I began to spot the echoes of proto-realism in the Old Testament scriptures and its explicit echoes in the New Testament. In re-looking at modernity, I could now diagnose its fatal cancer that led to skepticism and the death of reason, namely nominalism. I saw how empiricism in the mechanical philosophy was essentially an anti-Aristotelian experiment, one that could not stay the slide into skepticism, and ultimately postmodern relativism. Now, when reading the warning signs of modernity, I found that they declare the very thing I had learned in my journey. Turn back, O man. Nominalism is a dead end. Yet, for all of this clarity on the history of ideas, my perspective on the doctrines of Western Christianity were unchanged. I could now understand why Latin theology embraced Platonism, but I continued to see dissonance between the portrait of God painted by the Latin scholastics and the portrait painted by Holy Scripture. Hence, while my nominalism, and by extension materialism, crumbled in my hands, my commitments to the process picture of God remained. Section 5. Encountering the Eastern Church Fathers. My study of the history of ideas has always favored primary sources. From the start, my preferred method was to read a figure thoroughly, without any outside influence, in order to gain a sense of his thought, and then explore the scholarly literature. This allowed me to form a sense of the figure's thought based on careful textual analysis that I would then carry into the scholarly discussion. Having familiarized myself with the source material and developed a perspective of my own allowed me to assess these debates in an informed way, but it also helped me to see whether I had something to contribute, whether I had seen something that others had missed. In the case of Kant studies, this was certainly the case, and it would not be the last such instance. Upon entering my doctoral program, I was initiated into research methodology, the method endorsed by the program and taught by Richard Muller, one of its premier scholars who would become my doctorvater. I was delighted to find that Richard used the same method I did, only better. This emphasis on primary source analysis pervaded my doctoral program, and it was this method that ultimately led me to the Eastern Church Fathers. I enrolled in a class on the disputes from the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, through the Council of Constantinople, 381 AD. My study of church history had familiarized me with the events of this time and with its key figures, but I had never delved into the primary sources with any depth. The reason was that my entry point for the history of Christian thought was Augustine. Augustine admits that he hated Greek and read so little of it that he could gain virtually nothing from the Greek fathers. Hence my research program, which began with Augustine and then moved to both his influences and those he influenced, never intersected with Eastern patrology, and that changed. So did my life. The class began with the Arian dispute. The signed texts included a myriad of texts by Athanasius and Arius, of course, but also included works by Alexander of Alexandria and the Council of Nicaea itself. From there, we went on to study the Cappadocians, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, and their opponents, such as Apollinaris, Adius, and the Eunomians. Truthfully, I did not expect to find much that was new in these works. By this point, I had familiarized myself with the various systems of Christian thought, Latin patristic, medieval, and post-Reformation, Protestant and Catholic. I rarely encountered theological works that surprised me. If one understands Thomism, for example, the works of a Thomist tend to contain the expected. However, when reading the Eastern Church Fathers, what I encountered was jarringly unexpected, unfamiliar, even perplexing. When reading on the Trinity, what the Cappadocians seemed to describe was three members of common species, a stance utterly foreign to my understanding of the Western doctrine. Were this not perplexing enough, they spoke of a distinction between the essence of God and the energies of God, but I had no idea how to parse the difference. I was nonetheless struck by the ways in which their talk of God's energies used language that mirrored my process sensibilities, describing God's energetic activity as free, spontaneous, dynamic, active, immanent, relational, accessible. I could see its importance to the religious epistemology, that somehow the divine essence is unknowable, but the energies are not. Equally evident was that knowledge of God via his energies required some kind of participation in God by sacrament and holiness. But as intriguing as all of this was, the essence energies distinction was utterly opaque to me. On matters of salvation, I noticed a conspicuous absence of penal substitution. Salvation, it seemed, was accomplished by the incarnation itself, though the crucifixion and resurrection were certainly part of this, as was Christ's descent into Hades, which these fathers appeared to treat as salvific, on par with the crucifixion and resurrection. Evident enough was that the Son of God's acquisition of our nature somehow healed that nature, but how was unclear to me, not least because the divine energies played a role. And within this context, I stumbled again and again on the shocking language that salvation has as its goal the believer being made God by his participation in the divine nature. Amongst these many anomalies, I also discovered commitments that, far from mirroring Western orthodoxies, more closely mirror the moral intuitions that drove me from Western orthodoxies. Not only did I find no doctrine of inherited guilt, the very notion seemed alien to the Eastern mind. Gregory of Nyssa, for example, dismissed out of hand the idea that deceased infants are damned, since they are not yet moral agents and thus bear no guilt. As for whether God may freely do with sinners whatever he pleases, Athanasius argued the contrary. It would be unworthy of God to allow demonic schemes to undo his creation, making it incumbent upon the provident God to rescue his creatures. On predestination, I found that the Cappadocians, and Origen before them, dismissed outright the notion that God predetermines that a person should be damned and then orchestrates this outcome. For this would be unjust, and to ascribe such a deed to God would be blasphemous. In this, I discovered a hermeneutic principle that pervades the Eastern Fathers, namely that a text must never be read in a way that runs contrary to what we know to be true of God. Hence, Gregory of Nyssa instructs that one never read the Old Testament as ascribing passions of vengeance to God, for example. Rather, he, like Origen before him and the other Cappadocians with him, show how Old Testament passages that appear to preach divine vengeance are in fact aimed at the redemption of the wicked, even in the case of Pharaoh. In such principles, I found not a violation of my moral intuitions, but resonance with my view that such intuitions are a window into the divine. Thus, the dissonance between conscience and Christianity, as presented in these writers, began to evaporate before my eyes. For all that remained unclear to me about Eastern Christianity, one thing was abundantly clear. This was a form of Christianity unlike anything I knew, a Christianity that upended all of my conclusions about the history of the Christian religion. In these Eastern writers, I was discovering a form of Christianity that resonated with my moral intuitions, one that presented a dynamic deity in concert with that which I sought in process philosophy, one that, in short, offered everything I sought to construct on my own. And yet this Christianity was not the fabrication of some contemporary metaphysician in rebellion against tradition, but the work of figures central to the formation of Christian orthodoxy in the 4th century. An obsession grew within me, not only to understand their thought, but to discover whether such theology existed outside of this handful of figures. All of the aforementioned threads would prove important to my thought, but my point of entry was the Arian dispute. I noticed that Athanasius consistently argued that Arius' position, that the Son of God was created, carries a host of entailments. According to Athanasius, if the Son did not exist and then came into being, it follows that he is mutable, corruptible, accidentally good, and incapable of offering life to humanity. The case seemed to me to be a non sequitur. Why can't God create an immutable creature? Arius himself raised the same question. Rather, he pivoted to asserting exactly that. The Son is created, but he is created immutable. Yet Athanasius rejected the reply as impossible. To be created is to be mutable. I wondered if the response was empty rhetoric, but the other pro-Nicenes argued the same, so it seemed there was a rationale I was missing. As I dug deeper, I discovered a form of realism beneath Athanasius' case, a realism that sees generation similarly to Aristotle. Athanasius presumes that anything that did not exist and then came into being has a nature or form that was once a mere abstraction, the type of abstraction brought to mind when considering its possibility prior to its existence. The shift from mere abstraction to concrete reality occurs when something with the potential to manifest that form changes, moving that potential into concrete reality. Like Aristotle, matter is identified as the locus of potential. We might think of matter here defined like a shapeless bit of fabric that has the potential to take on any number of shapes. Were it draped around a ball, for example, it would take on sphericality. The manifest sphericality would not be native to the fabric, but communicated to it by the ball. So in the same way, matter is potentially any number of things. Or phrased otherwise, matter has the potential to bear any number of forms. Generation is the manifestation of form in matter when material potential moves into concrete reality. Such a view of generation was evident in the fact that while Athanasius spoke about creation out of nothing, when speaking about generation, he would speak of the movement from non-being into being, using the ancient term for matter as potential. I found that the reading is confirmed by Arius himself, who replies that he does not believe the Son of God derives existence from matter, confirming that this is the case against him. The revelation unlocked for me Athanasius's case, and the case of the Pro-Nicenes generally, in suggesting that there was a time when the Son of God was not. Arius is admitting that there was a time when the Son was an abstract possibility, but then transitioned into concrete reality. The reason there is no getting around his mutability is because the shift from potential to real is a mutation. Hence, to say the Son is created immutable lands in formal contradiction. He cannot mutate, but he mutated into being. This metaphysics also illumined the other entailments of Arianism, argued by the Pro-Nicenes. For example, corruption. Keep in mind that matter is nothing but the potential to be something. Forms that manifest within it are not native to it, and thus any form that enters matter can also retreat from matter. For this reason, the same potential that makes generation possible, receiving form, also makes the inverse possible, the release of form, which is called corruption. Thus, every creature has the innate potential for either positive, generation, or negative, corruption, change. And in the case of free creatures who have moral and spiritual potential, such capacity includes the capacity to grow in virtue or descend into vice. Hence, the Pro-Nicene charge that Arius' son is not only corruptible, but could become evil like the devil. More importantly, however, this insight unlocked for me the Pro-Nicene understanding of Christianity generally and its gospel specifically. Having followed the train of reasoning to the conclusion that creatures are corruptible of metaphysical necessity, this naturally raised the question of whether there is any escaping corruptibility. Can a creature ever hope to become good and rest in that goodness? Or does the threat of falling into vice always remain? To my surprise, I found that the Eastern Fathers were not only attuned to such a question, but it was central to their understanding of Christian hope. Evident already was that the Incarnation had as its end the healing of humanity, and the believer being made God, deification. In their talk of deification, it became clear that they understood Christ's offer of immortality and incorruption in the resurrection to come by participating in the divine nature. In a word, God offers to the creature his own immortality, his own incorruption. And I found that the Eastern Fathers understood incorruption to include unturnability, a participation in God's own benevolence that allows the creature to rest in goodness and ends the prospect of retreat into moral or spiritual corruption. I could see that deification was closely linked with the divine energies. As I dug deeper into the essence energies distinction, I could see why. I found that the distinction is traceable to Aristotle, was received and developed by Alexandrian Judaism, and echoes in Paul before ever arriving in the hands of the Eastern Fathers. I found that the distinction is between a nature and its operative power, such as the distinction between mind and the power of speech that expresses mind. The Eastern Fathers, like the Alexandrian Jews before them, recognized that in some cases the operative powers or energies of a nature are communicable to something of a different nature. To use a favorite analogy of the Fathers, the nature of fire expresses itself in the energies of heating and lighting. Metal has an innate susceptibility to these energies, such that metal can commune with fire until it comes to glow and burn. The inflamed metal does not become fire, but it nonetheless participates in the nature of fire via the energies of fire. So, in the same way, man as an icon of God is susceptible to the attributes of God. We are made to commune with God, and through that communion, participate in the energies of God. And amongst these energies are immortality, incorruption, and unturnability. Such participation was offered to man prior to the fall, and the incarnation has as its goal the restoration of this participation. The view made sense of the Arian disputes and the Christological disputes to follow. Athanasius and the Pro-Nicenes saw Arianism as deadly poison because the incarnation offers humanity a bridge back to the divine nature, the only nature that can offer immortality, incorruption, and unturnability. But if the Son is a creature, then his nature is no less susceptible to corruption than our own. In short, Arianism undermines Christian hope, and so it was in the Christological disputes of Constantinople. Apollinaris's Christology undermined the full humanity of Christ. The concern here was the same. Christ takes on our nature in order to heal it and reunite it with God. If his appropriation of our nature is incomplete, then so is our healing. Here I discovered a picture of Christianity unlike anything I had ever known. And all that I had read from Western writers, Christianity was a judicial religion. God is primarily a moral lawgiver and a judge. The human condition is marked by moral defect, moral infractions, and future judgment. The incarnation provides judicial rectitude to rescue believers from impending condemnation. But in the Eastern Fathers, I found a different picture. Man, as an icon of God, is made to partake of the divine nature. And in that partaking, he transcends his own nature, putting off his mortality for immortality, his corruptibility for incorruptibility, his turnability for unturnability. By partaking of the divine nature, man's higher nature, the rational soul, which is the icon of God within him, is not only deified, but this icon communicates divine life to man's lower nature, raising it up, enabling it to partake of God in ways that it otherwise could not. And this really is the vision of the cosmos writ large. Those things that are most godlike, the hierarchy of angels and the soul of man, are meant to serve as conduits, mediators, imbibing God's energies and carrying those energies to things lower in the chain, like inflamed metal that carries the heat and light of fire within it. These icons are made to carry divine light down to things lower in creation, to things otherwise incapable of deification, such as animals and plants. Such is the Eastern patristic vision of the cosmos, God pouring himself out, cascading divine energy down through the hierarchy of angels to man, to animals, plants, even rocks, until all things are energized, deified, aglow with uncreated light, transformed and elevated, partaking of God as much as they are able. Yet this cascade is impeded when the icons of God fall, when angels or man turn from God. These conduits of divine energy cut off the channels of God to the world, stopping the flow of life to things subordinate to them. And in cutting off divine life, death takes hold. In angels, this turning from the good is a spiritual twisting, a distortion of their nature. In man, the higher nature is subjugated to the lower nature, and the natural mortality of the lower takes hold, as do the passions, which gain unnatural sway over the soul, crippling its ability to deify. And for those things beneath man, set in his care, for whom the deification of man is their only means of partaking of God, these too are cut off from God, bound by their innate mortality. This is the demonic scheme aimed at dragging the cosmos away from God, banishing from the world the light of God, plunging the cosmos into darkness and death. And it is into this darkness that the Creator himself enters, becoming a creature, bearing human nature. He enters our nature in order to untwist his creation from within, setting it right, uniting it again to himself, that he might pour life into it and heal it. I found the vision compelling, even beautiful. Though years earlier, the metaphysical commitments of the Eastern Fathers would have troubled me, my new commitment to realism made me more than open to it. What I saw in their realism, however, was something more than mere metaphysics, I saw how realism informed the Eastern patristic view of creation, which set the table for the creaturely condition. I saw how the common nature of the members of the Trinity was central to the insistence that the life of the Father is also in the Son, who is of the same nature. I saw how the common nature of man is what makes it possible for Christ to heal humanity, taking on that which is within each one of us. Suddenly, realism and its role in Trinitarianism and Christology was not simply a tool for schematizing a set of Christian commitments or solving a puzzle. Instead, it bore very real importance to Christian hope. The doctrine of the common nature of the divine persons, the common nature of man, and the union of that common nature in Christ with the divine nature was all exceedingly practical, central to understanding what has gone wrong in the world and what has set it right. I was staring into a Christianity unlike anything I had ever encountered, and which offered everything I had sought to construct on my own, only far better, far more compelling, far more beautiful. The question that grew within me was whether this strange form of Christianity was relegated to these 4th century figures, or whether it could be found in other Eastern Christians. So I obsessively dug, looking backward into the Eastern Fathers before the Pro-Nicenes, and forward into the other 5 ecumenical councils and later fathers, such as Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, and others. Much to my surprise, I found that these and other fathers and councils carried within their breast the very same understanding of Christianity that I had read in the 4th century. Even more shocking was that they insisted that this was the Christianity they received from the apostles themselves, which was entrusted to the fathers before them, and which they now seek to preserve and propagate. Candidly, I had never seen such continuity of thought across so many hundreds of years. I recognized developments in language or in the articulation of concepts, but I saw no real innovation, no real divergence. The continuity struck me as miraculous, as did the frequency with which the ecumenical councils course-corrected against all odds. Here, in these writers and in these councils, it seemed I was staring at the hand of providence, at the fulfillment of Christ's promise to lead his church into all truth. My lingering question was whether this Christianity still exists. Keep in mind that I studied all of this by tracing the works of the Fathers. I had not yet encountered Eastern Orthodoxy, but I soon connected the Eastern in Eastern Orthodoxy with the Eastern Patriarchates of the Roman Empire, and thus with the Eastern Fathers. So I determined to investigate whether this tradition persisted today within the Orthodox Church. Section 6. The Journey East. By the providence of God, I lived only a block from a very large, very beautiful Orthodox church. I entered in search of a priest and met Father Raphael daily. He listened to my rather lengthy story about my spiritual journey and what I had discovered in the Eastern Church Fathers. He then confirmed that the theology I was describing was indeed the theology of the Orthodox Church. He pointed to icons around the temple of the very figures I had been reading. The tradition they articulated and defended is the same tradition lived today in the Orthodox Church. I was razed to the ground. How had I never encountered this tradition before? At Father Daly's invitation, I resolved to attend a divine liturgy, to see for myself this lived tradition. Here I should offer an aside for further context. The temptation when telling the story of a journey is to create a straight line, and sometimes in the telling, excursions and side roads fall away. A pair of such side roads are critical to understanding the impact of my first divine liturgy. The first concerns the intersection of art and religion. As an artist, I had always been fascinated by religious art that adorned temples and cathedrals. Such artwork drew me in, not only for technical reasons, but because it seemed somehow transcendent, as if its religious function elevated it, as if it somehow served as a conduit for something greater than itself. Such artwork and the temples they adorned seemed to carry that odd intersection, indicative of holiness itself, which lays one low with sublimity and tempts one to retreat with dread, while simultaneously drawing one in by that very same sublimity. I found the phenomenon alluring, captivating. seductive, but I also had no place in my thinking, especially in the days of my nominalism, for understanding this phenomenon as anything more than a psychological effect, though it certainly felt as if it was something more. The second bit of context was my fascination with ancient worship. As I'm sure is evident from the foregoing, I was drawn to ancient religion of the kind read about in the Old Testament: temples, priests, ritual. Fascination is the wrong word for what I saw in these. I saw proper religion. Or rather, if religion is real, if the divine is real, if there is an invisible world that man may approach by means of religion, then this is what it should look like, what it should feel like. Approaching a deity should not feel safe or comfortable. Its dwelling should not feel common, but sublime, otherworldly. For this reason, one of my favorite texts during my process years was the book of Leviticus. Strange as it may sound, peering into a priest's manual of the ancient world conveyed something of the nature of the Hebrew God, and with this, the prescriptions for approaching such a deity. In this I saw true religion, but I presume that such religion was a relic of the past, something no longer practiced in our world today, a fact that I deeply lamented. My experience of the divine liturgy drew together these disparate threads. Not only did I enter a living, breathing embodiment of the philosophy and theology of the Eastern Church Fathers I had grown to love, but I entered temple worship of a kind that I thought had been lost to time and history. Within this temple, I encountered holiness and sublimity, and adorning every inch was religious art that carried that sense of transcendence. With both mind and every sense, I was assailed with the incarnate reality of what I had groped after only abstractly. Impossible though it seemed, I was beholding the object of my soul's longing. I wish I could say that this marked the end of my journey, but it did not. As compelling as the divine liturgy was, I was left with a great many questions that are all too common when a person first encounters orthodoxy, about Mary, hagiography, iconography, and so on. I began to meet regularly with Father Daly to dialogue about such matters. He wisely pointed me back to the very fathers I had been reading, insisting that these practices are traced back to them, as are the answers to my questions. So I began to dig back into the Eastern Church Fathers, and time and again, I found that their answers were far more compelling than my objections. As one objection after another fell, I finally crossed the threshold. While questions remained, I had seen enough to be convinced that whatever question I might ask, these fathers have a compelling answer. In this moment, I shifted from understanding in search of faith to faith seeking understanding. And I resolved that this was indeed the true church, established by Christ and his apostles, a keeper of the faith once given over to the saints, which had been preserved in all truth by the providence of God. My final entrance into the Orthodox Church would take years. My wife at the time had neither knowledge of nor interest in the Orthodox Church, and at the guidance of Father Daly, I became a catechumen and resolved to wait for her. The waiting took 7 years, a bout with cancer, and the whole of our life falling apart. But in the dust and ashes of that, we finally determined that the one thing we needed more than anything else was the church. And so our entire family was chrismated in the fall of 2015. So there you have it, dear listeners. That is my journey through philosophy and into orthodoxy that shapes so much of what you hear me talk about today. I did notice here at the end that my math was apparently wrong. I had said at the opening that it was 2016. I trust that when I wrote this, I was a bit more careful than that, and so apparently it was fall of 2015. So there you have it. That's a glimpse into my world and how I became the Dr. Nathan Jacobs that you listen to here on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. So with that, I'm signing off. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.